Welcome to Soho Strangler Week by Murdermile. To accompany the series, here's a few extra details from the police files and the court records, to aid your enjoyment and maybe even help you crack the case. This episode is about how the victims are demonised in the eyes of the people. So why do we do it? Why do we demonise the victims? Well, the thing is, serial killers are fascinating. Go into any bookshop. There are more books on serial killers than the victims. And in most books on serial killers, the victims' lives are barely amount to like a small percentage of the book. And often, the only reason they're really there is so we can find out how they actually met their killer and what went wrong, which, in a way, is victim blaming. In order to have a fascination with serial killers, or even hero worshipping a killer, as some people do, but many won't admit to that, you can't openly praise their cunning, their intelligence, their skill, or even their mission, as you can see with Jack the Ripper, their mission as a moral guardian. Or even more sickeningly, as some people do, praising serial killers for their looks as if there's something to be fancied. So first, in order to find a way to demonise the victims, first you have to make the victims less worthy of living than the killer themselves, which unfortunately is what a lot of people do when they praise serial killers. Sometimes in the press you can do this by just ignoring the victims, reducing them down to just the bare essentials of them just being a name, an age, a collection of injuries. Often you can kind of focus on the serial killer and treat the victims more like they're just a prop or a piece of meat to guide you into how you'd find the information about this serial killer, why he chose them, why he killed them in that specific way. They're really just a prop, a piece of meat. And almost in a way, by heroising the serial killers, what you're actually doing is saying, these are the victims and they were, let's use air quotes here, chosen to be slaughtered by him for his pleasure, almost as if it was a gift from God. So that's kind of another way of which we demonise the victims. Mostly we demonise the victims by attacking just the simple things like their physical attractiveness, their moral choices, just the way they live their lives. We kind of try and put ourselves on a higher pedestal than them, and we look down at them from our moral position and go, oh, look at that, look how terrible they are. And that's the thing, that's what makes it so easy, especially with things like Jack the Ripper, Soho Strangler. It's easier to demonise these victims. Why? Because they're prostitutes. We can look down on them and go, oh, look how morally loose they are, look how fallen they are. If they're drug addicts, even better. It makes it easier for us to kind of demonise them and put the killer on a pedestal, and therefore it's acceptable for us to kind of dive into the killer's life and go, oh, aren't they fascinating? Aren't they clever? Aren't they witty? Look how they evaded the police. Look how intelligent they are. So what I'm going to do with this section is we'll go through a lot of the press articles to do with the different victims in the Soho Strangler case, and we'll look at how different they are. So let's start at the very beginning. We have, of course, French Fifi. This was the first murder. As you can kind of see, have a look at, there's a real correlation between French Fifi and Catherine Maud Chamberlain, who was the victim up in Durham, who was murdered by Norman Stephenson. So if you haven't listened to the series yet, spoilers. But you can see a correlation there. There's the reporting of the Catherine Maud Chamberlain case is very factual, very flat, very to the point. They're just going down to the details. French Fifi is identical. When you look at it, I'll read you just a couple of articles and you can see there's no kind of monster in there. There's no myth. Very little kind of demonising of Fifi, except what you would expect from an article about a prostitute who was murdered. There will always be a kind of a moralising in there. So let's read this. This was the Daily Telegraph. Headline, woman dead in West End flat, stocking around neck. That was a headline. Pretty standard. All the facts are there. It goes, Mrs. Josephine Martin, age 46, known as Fifi, and believed to be of French nationality, was found yesterday in a top-floor flat in Archer Street, Soho. She was on a bed, fully dressed, with a silk stocking tightly round her neck. The discovery was made about noon by Mrs. Martin's French maid. She notified the Globe Club, which is in the same building, and Mr. Lance George, an actor, and others went to the flat. Artificial respiration was tried in vain. Superintendent Walter Hambrook of Scotland Yard took charge of the case. Sir Bernard Spilsbury was called in to decide whether the woman's death was due to foul play. Mrs. Martin is believed to have been well off, and the possibility of a robbery is being investigated. Taxi drivers are being asked if they drove a man and a woman to Archer Street late on Sunday night, and election literature, which arrived at the flat shortly afterwards, was addressed to a Mr. and Mrs. J. Martin. There's a little bit extra after that, but when you look at that, pretty normal, unsensational. Do you know, the facts are there, even though there's a couple of things in there which aren't exactly true. It's still early days. The press are kind of getting details. They don't know what's right yet. They're kind of still finding their feet in the same way that the police are finding their way yet. But nothing sensational, really. It's like, even with her name, they say her name is Josephine Martin, known as Fifi. Pretty much it. Just a very standard story. Another article, same day in the Daily Herald. Woman's death in West End flat, strangled by her own stocking. Scotland Yard officers investigating the death mystery of a woman in the Soho flat yesterday had not ruled out the possibility that she'd been murdered. The woman known as Mrs. Josephine Martin was found strangled, fully clothed, on her bed, with one of her stockings tied tightly around her neck. The knot was on the left-hand side, and police are puzzled by this fact. Pretty standard. Do you know, they've got the details, they've put it out there. Nothing too exciting, sensational. You can kind of see with this, because in their eyes there's only one murdered woman so far. She happens to be a prostitute. She happens to live in Soho. It's not sensational. Do you know, there's not 3 murders. There's not 5. We're not building up. They're kind of guessing that this is going to be something that's going to be a one-off. It's going to be easily forgotten. Now, this is where the mystery creeps in, with Sir Bernard Spilsbury and Dr. Charles Burney, the police surgeon, and they're trying to work out, is this a suicide? Is this a murder? And they're both at loggerheads at that point. They're going into the autopsy, and what they want to do is not make an announcement, quite rightly, until they've absolutely categorically confirmed, is it a murder, is it a suicide? Unfortunately, that takes a couple of days, and well, in total it takes 3 weeks until the inquest, and even at that point they do say murder by balance of probability. But in the world of the press, 1 day without new information on a murder, they've got to write something, they've got to do something. So November the 6th, the next day, Daily Herald. Silk stocking riddle baffles police. See, already the mystery element has already been started. Nearly 2 days after the discovery of the body of Mrs. Josephine Martin in her flat on Archer Street, Scotland Yard detectives are unable to state how she died. Sir Bernard Spilsbury made a post-mortem. It has been found that the words, "I love you till I die," were tattooed on one of her legs. West End acquaintances of French Fifi told the Daily Herald last night that they feared sooner or later she would be killed by some man. Now, this is interesting. They've already started to put the mystery elements in there. They've already focused that they're using her name, but also French Fifi, the full kind of prostitute title. You'll notice later on that they start to use the prostitute title more than they use her proper name. And already they've put in the little detail about the tattoo on the leg. Therefore, we're kind of thinking, was this the man who murdered her? He loved her too much. He wanted her dead. Already you can see newspapers starting to disparage her as well. So the Evening Standard on the 5th, post-mortem on woman found dead in flat. So it's just an article saying that they're doing a post-mortem, but they haven't got any details yet. And already they're saying people are being interviewed with criminal records. So already they're saying, well, this is going to be involving working class people, people who are of a lower standard to everyone else because they've got criminal records. Therefore, she hung around with those kinds of people. Therefore, she's of lower moral value. Even in here, Daily Herald would say CID men search cafes, trying to solve the Soho flat mystery. Scotland Yard officers investigating the Soho flat murder of Mrs. Josephine Martin, the 41-year-old Russian woman, don't forget she wasn't Russian, have formed the opinion that she was strangled by a man who knew her well. It is stated that since the death of the woman 3 weeks ago, CID men have been shadowing a man. They weren't shadowing a man. There was they love in the panic. We'll dive into this in the panic section, but they love to show the story of CID men shadowing. It's like there was no shadowing going on. They talk about loads of plainclothed officers swarming Soho, keeping an eye on all these deep, dark denizens of Soho's dirty red light district. Didn't happen. There was the regular police force were out there. They were keeping an eye out for the man who, well, later, anyone who kind of looked suspicious, anyone who they kind of knew. Following Tuesday's inquest verdict of murder against persons unknown, police intensified their search of scores of cafes and nightclubs in the West End in the hope of finding a clue. See, cafes and nightclubs, not restaurants, not nice places. The murderer has to be someone who hangs out in a nasty place like a cafe and a nightclub. Oh, dirty. Daily Herald on the 7th. Detectives believe that robbery was a motive. Friends declare that Fifi had large sums of money in her flat, but none were found by the police. She hadn't got large sums of money in the flat. Police found no money in the flat. But as mentioned in the episode, that doesn't actually mean that she didn't have money in the flat. The money could have been stolen. But given the way that she lived, and given the fact that if she did have a pimp, most of the money would have gone to him anyway. She wouldn't have had lots of money in the flat. Or if she did, he would have taken it. We start with French Fifi getting into the idea of the white slave trade as well. So this is already by the 7th of November. So she's been dead 2 days. And the Daily Herald already saying, last night, none of the persons they, i.e. the police, wish to interview have been discovered despite intensive combing of the underworld. That keeps cropping up, so you will see the words underworld, suggesting that she only consorts with criminals. But as we know, if statistics are to be believed that 1 in 10 men visit prostitutes, then does that mean that 1 in 10 men are criminals and all criminals visit prostitutes? I think unlikely. I think it's a wide variety of different people. Interesting with these articles as well, what I noticed was a real reverence for authority as well. So when you see police mentioned, it's always Detective Chief Inspector. They will always give him his full title. Sir Bernard Spilsbury, there you go, title right there. Especially as he's got a knighthood as well. But when it comes to the prostitutes, she may be lucky if she gets her married title, like Mrs. Josephine Martin, but they will always write Mrs. Josephine Martin, prostitute, also known as French Fifi. Which is one of the reasons why, for clarity throughout the Soho Strangler, I deliberately use their prostitute name, the prostitute moniker, because that's kind of what the press were hanging everything onto. But it's kind of immoral in a way that we're kind of demonising these women by just saying, well, they're just prostitutes and that's all they'll ever be. Daily Herald again. This is not just to blame the Daily Herald. This is quite often the Daily Herald. They wrote a lot more articles than everyone else, which is why quite often you'll hear me say Daily Herald. Daily Herald. The police intensified their search of scores of cafes and nightclubs in the West End in the hope of finding a clue. Again, stating that only working class people would be suspected, not good, decent people of society. The People, 27th of November. Death of French Fifi baffles Yard. In there, they have a little section that goes Yard theories. 1, that she was the 4th victim of a gang of white slavers with whom she had dealings, some of whom believed that statements she made led to the arrests of a gang. And 2, that she was murdered by a tapper, an underworld criminal who preys upon women of her type. So they're all in there. It's all there's a boat going past. That just distracted me. They got their music on. Oh, see, I knew my boat was going to get rammed by that. Big article. This was one of the articles that I found fascinating. This was in the Daily Express. It's undated, but unfortunately it was one of these articles that was syndicated everywhere. And it was titled, "Clear the Gunman Out of Britain." I'll read you a piece of this. It just goes, the murder, i.e. Fifi, has been linked with 3 other murders. Marshal Chevalier, a young French acrobat murdered in Piccadilly in 1924, was found with his throat cut 12 years ago on the corner of Eyre Street, Piccadilly. He was known by the police as a white slave trafficker. His murder was due to a gang feud. The second link is the murder in a Soho club in 1926 of Charles Balatta. We're going to deal with that in Murder Mile, hopefully this year. He was shot dead by Emile Berthier, a convicted white slaver, now serving sentence in Broadmoor. He wasn't a white slaver. The third link is the murder of Mrs. Josephine Martin, also known as French Fifi. She was strangled with a silk stocking. Emile Allard, aka Red Max, was in correspondence with associates of Chevalier. He frequented the Soho club where Balatta was shot. He is known to have met French Fifi at least once a week, and it is believed that Emile Allard, i.e. Red Max, knew the secret of French Fifi's murder. It is probable that this was the reason he was murdered. He was suspected of being an informer or copper's narc who gave Scotland Yard the information which led to the deportations of French Fifi's death. He knew too much, they put in bold capitals there. Also, the murder may have been inspired by his vengeance. Now, I actually wasted a whole afternoon diving into all of the details in this small article to see how much of it was true. So I went through a lot of the back histories. I went through the Marshal Chevalier file. I went through the Charles Balatta file, which I'd already got copies of anyway, because that's coming up in Murder Mile. Red Max, or his known aliases, do not appear anywhere in the police or court records of Marshal Le Chevalier. I also double-checked his aliases as well. Red Max does not appear in any of the court records for the murder of Charles Balatta. Red Max does not appear anywhere in the police or court records for French Fifi. So you go through the whole of the French Fifi file, he does not appear. Roger Vernon does not appear. So everything is very confusing, especially when the press decide to make links, but they don't clarify anything. They just go, well, this will be nice, because they know full well, especially with newspapers. Today it's a news story. Tomorrow we use that newspaper to wrap up our fish and chips. No one will care anymore. And if they're entirely wrong, all they have to do is if it's front page news and they put a big thing in there, so have a look at the Matthew Kelly case years ago, the actor Matthew Kelly, who loaned out his home in Philippines or somewhere like that, loaned it out to this guy. The guy turned out to be a paedophile. The press jumped all over it and said, Matthew Kelly, paedophile. And they'd got on the front page article, they got boxes being removed from the house, and in there was a DVD of Dumbo, which was precariously placed on top so the press could get a very clear view of it. It was clearly a set-up shot. And they were like, Matthew Kelly, paedophile. His entire career was ruined. Found entirely innocent. And what did they do in the end? They put in a little apology on page 17. After all these weeks of demonising him, a little tiny thing on page 17 saying, we may have got some details wrong, our source was incorrect. That's what they do. They can make up any old shit. Why? Because it's entertainment. Entertainment, and they're selling newspapers, and they want you to keep buying. Therefore, they need the stories to be more sensational. If you have a choice between two or three newspapers, and one is a really exciting headline, and the other one is, man who used to be on TV found with Dumbo DVD, and the other one goes, Matthew Kelly, paedophile! ! Which one do you go for? You go for the sensational one, and they know that. So let's dive in with French Marie. I keep too many Maries in this episode. There's two, and there's too many. So Marie Cotton, even though she's not a prostitute, as far as we know, Still, the press are trying to make her sinister, so they do that right at the start by saying her name is Marie Jeanette Cotton. It's actually incorrect, it's Jean-Marie Cotton, but we can excuse the press for being a bit thick there. And they say whose real name was Cousins. Actually, it wasn't. Cotton was her real name, Cousins was her married name, but by doing that, they're implying an alias. Again, with all the victims as well, they keep making reference to a bohemian lifestyle. Now, when you kind of look at it, it's kind of bohemian lifestyle just means you do things slightly different from everyone else. But when you look at Marie Cotton's life, what's different about her life? She's a cleaner. She goes out in the morning, she goes around to this guy's house, she cleans the flat, she gets paid £4 a week. That's her job. She makes dinner in the evenings. There's nothing bohemian about her life, but you can demonise her by instantly saying bohemian lifestyle. It makes it kind of makes it seem sinister, and you don't need to explain it. Even here, the article says the dead woman lived a bohemian life, and it is thought that she may have met her death at the hands of an acquaintance. What bohemian lifestyle? It's very funny in all of these articles, as I mentioned before, because very few journalists were actually sent to the scene. What they actually did was they just copy and pasted from all the other articles. They were like, yep, that one in the People looks good, we'll steal that. So bohemian lifestyle is repeated everywhere, but nobody ever gives a reference to it, a point at which we say, we know she's bohemian because... Bohemianism is a practice of an unconventional lifestyle. This is from the dictionary. Often the company of like-minded people and with few permanent ties. It involves music, artistic, literary and spiritual pursuits. As mentioned, she's a cleaner. She's just doing a job. What's bohemian about that? Lots of inaccuracies. Now, because it's a speed medium, obviously the press make a lot of mistakes as they go along. So they keep making reference to her as mentioned by her other name. Inaccuracies in that. So here was one. This was the Leicester Evening Mail on the 18th, 1936, and it stated, police have taken away a blood-splattered door. This was from Marie Jeanette Cotton. As mentioned in the episode, she was strangled. There was a small bit of blood around her nose and her mouth, but it hadn't sprayed anywhere because it was literally as she'd fallen on the floor, as she was dying, she had a bit of a nosebleed. It went onto the floor. It wasn't splattered anywhere. But in the press, they repeatedly say the police have taken away a blood-splattered door. They didn't. In fact, the blood didn't even move. In truth, they actually took away the door because they found fingerprints on it. But when they double-checked it, the fingerprints were actually the first police constable to turn up. It's his fingerprints, unfortunately. In an open cupboard, they found £14 in notes and silver. That's incorrect. I've actually got the police itinerary here. No money was found. £14 in 1936 would have been about £1,100. That's a hell of a lot of money. But again, they've printed it. They haven't bothered to check it. They don't care. If you put in that amount of money with this woman who's working just as allegedly as a cleaner, and she's bohemian, and there's all this money instantly, well, this is very exciting, isn't it? There's also the aura of criminality there. I mentioned in the episode about a letter that came through. I can't remember the lady's name. And it was titled. This article, Daily Telegraph, is titled "French Clue to Soho Murder." Woman's statement, a possible clue. That this woman came from Boulogne during the weekend. A French woman who was known Mrs. Cotton well in London, made an important statement to the police. She stated that she was in fear and refused to disclose her name. Now, this is all untrue. I used her statement in the episode itself. This was Josephine Poulequin. She said she'd read about it in the paper. She knew Marie briefly for a couple of months, and she volunteered a statement, and she even said that she would happily come to court if required. In her statement, there's no reference to threats, anything like that. But in the press, it's like, we can't just say that she gave a statement. We have to say she was in fear for her life. Of course they do, because it makes it exciting. Quite often in the press as well. So, because in this episode, I had to put Red Max further away in the episode, because I didn't want to give away too much too soon. The chronology is... Fifi was murdered, then Red Max was murdered, then Roger Vernon went to prison, then it was then it was Marie Cotton was murdered, then Dutch Leia, then French Marie. So Red Max was actually earlier on. If anything, I would have put him in at episode 3, but I needed to save that to the end because he was a key suspect. But even throughout this, quite often the press would be constantly trying to make references to French Fifi and Red Max and the other victims. So from the point after Red Max's murder, you will see Red Max constantly put into these articles. Interestingly, they barely mention Roger Vernon. But in the police report, it would state, it has been stated in the press that the deceased was associated with Max Cassell, French Fifi and other notorious undesirables of French origin, and that she was murdered because she knew too much. There is not an atom of truth in the reports, which are libelous and fake in their entirety. And that was Chief Inspector Sharp. So this takes us to Dutch Leia. You can really... this is where I started with this whole case. When I was originally going to do Murder Mile, the book, originally this was where I started. I was going to do some more... digging into the Dutch Leia case, because I wanted to re-go through it again. And when I started looking at the press reports, that's when I realised how structured they are to kind of make us dislike her, and therefore we will kind of, as people and society, we will kind of accept the fact that she's murdered, because we will go, well, it was her choice that she lived that life, and therefore she was murdered because she made the wrong decisions. Again, demonising the victim. So you could see that. You can see in every article, it would pretty much every article, it'd be the first paragraph would be a brief overview of the murder. Then it would go into why it was acceptable that she should be murdered, why we shouldn't pity her, and we'll dive into that. And then it becomes the creating of this monster. Who killed her? First off, they like to try and reference her as an outsider. Just straight off the back, she's a prostitute. She's bohemian. Therefore, she's unconventional, unorthodox. She's carefree. Her mother would state, "I did not know much about my own daughter's life, except that she'd been working in the West End for years." Oddly, her mother would also say that she tried to get her out of prostitution. As far as we know, that's complete and utter bullshit. The police didn't take much credit in Dutch Leia's mum's statement, Kathleen Hind, because she was a blackmailer. She used, a lot of her statements don't make sense. Again, they play up the mystery of her name, the fact that she was Leia Smith, Leia Hind, Leia Hines, Dutch Leia, Constance May Hind, Constance Smith, and that she was known as Stilts. That was apparently her nickname was Stilts Leia because she was really short, but therefore she wore high heels. I can't find any reference from any of the prostitutes who knew her who say we knew her as Stilts. I think that's a fabrication invented by the press because it makes her sound a little bit tarty. Whereas all of the prostitutes who knew her would say most of them knew her as Leia. Very few knew her as Constance or I haven't actually heard any of the prostitutes refer to her as Dutch Leia, except the ones who didn't seem to know her and the ones who got their information from the press. Again, there's with a lot of the victims, there seems to be an idea. If you're a Patreon subscriber, you'll have seen some of the articles that I posted, and quite often they make reference to pretty brunette murdered in Soho, and this is the same here. She's constantly described as pretty brunette. They focus in on her age because she's young. Again, add the word prostitute in there, which kind of implies that she was chosen by a killer. This is with this, what I've tried to do with this story is focus on French petite brunette, but there's a kind of a prettiness there, which a lot of the press would pick up on and go, well, he's deliberately picked these ones because they're of a specific type and he kind of fancies them. Some reference to her past, therefore that's why he wanted to kill her. So she was murdered because of how she looked, not because of some kind of mentality, some deformity inside his brain. It's her fault that she was murdered because she was pretty. You see that with a lot of cases with serial killers as well. They always focus on how young and pretty the girls were, as opposed to, here's a serial killer, he's a mental fuck up. Do you know, he's fucked up, he's deranged, he should be locked up. No, it's the lady's fault that she was murdered because she was attractive. Again, you can see a reference to the xenophobia that's going on. So obviously, we're post World War One, World War Two is about to kick off. So there's a lot of kind of fear of foreign. I think if I've already put out the Stanley King statement, he ends it with his second statement with, I believe the man was of foreign origin. And this is what's going on around this time. All the articles make reference to Leah Hines being of German extraction. She wasn't German at all, but even in quite a lot of the articles, they were put in bold between the paragraphs, German, she was German extraction. Why? Because it helps you go, well, that's the reason she was murdered. She's an undesirable. Interestingly, especially with Dutch Leia as well, they love to mention the fact. Here's just a few samples I've cut out. She was found partially dressed. She was in a state of undress. She was just in her nightdress. She was just in her underwear. All of which implying a sex worker, all of which implying morally loose. They always tie this together with the fact that she had a husband, but she wasn't living with her husband. She had a boyfriend who was living there, and yet she would bring men back to the flat. Also, here in the Daily Mirror, her naked shoulders were marked and scratched. So straight off referencing the fact that she's on a bed and that she's naked and dressed only in her undergarments. Well, there we go. And repeatedly found on the bed. Dead girl on bed. Almost as if, same again, she's lying there, she's waiting for this killer to come and her life is so pointless and useless, and thank God, here comes a killer who's going to come along and immortalise her. And I think that's one of the most tragic things, really, is when you think about all of these murders of prostitutes that have gone on, and hopefully with one of these nugget things that I'm doing here, hopefully I'm going to dive into the other murders that happened in around Soho around the same time. But most of these women, their names will never be remembered for at all. Even like by the time they were murdered, they were forgotten. But with someone like Jack the Ripper, they've been immortalised, but they've only been immortalised as victims. They've only been immortalised as, I'm going to say in inverted commas, prostitutes, even though many of them weren't. So it's kind of tragic in a way that they only get they only get a bit of recognition for their life because they were a prop or a device for a serial killer, not as a person. Criminal record, they constantly reference in Dutch Leia's criminal record. Throughout, they're always attributing her to French Fifi, even though we have no knowledge of whether Dutch Leia and French Fifi knew each other. No one mentions it in any of the witness statements. They don't say, even though they live 2 streets apart, no one ever says, oh, they were best friends. They never mentioned. So French Fifi is mentioned in there, Red Max is mentioned in there, Marie Cotton is mentioned in there. Quite often she's incorrectly attributed as being a sex worker as well. Much later on, they will also mention Black Rita, who's a case I hope to get to on Murder Mile, Ginger Ray, episodes 8 and 9, Russian Dora, I'm still building that one up, and Margaret Cook, which is episode 13. So these are all murders from the 1940s, late 1940s, but they're tying them all in together as if they're connected. And with Dutch Leia as well, they very much, I've kind of mentioned this earlier on, but they very much want this area that she's in to be known as an underworld. It's where all the criminals hang out. It's dark, it's dingy. You can almost get a feeling like there's no daylight there. It's kind of people walking around and muttering to each other, and they've all got drugs in their pockets, and check me out, talking about drugs in pockets, because that's what people do, isn't it? Drugs in pockets. Whereas when you look at Dutch Letter, and then we go on to French Marie, because the case has been out of favour, because the Soho Strangler is almost forgotten, because the press have actually forgotten that they created the Soho Strangler. It's their creation. They're the ones who came up with the name itself. We've gone back to how we were with the first case with French Fifi. It's kind of, the press are just kind of reporting things as they are. With French Marie, they describe her as 5'3", 48 years old, medium build, pale complexion, rouge cheeks, reddish brown hair, with blue eyes. It's kind of a bit normal, isn't it? It's just that there's no, when you go through the article, there's no bold capitals saying Jews, foreign, German extraction. There's none of that. There's no monsters. There's no fear mongering. They do, because she's a prostitute, they do kind of try and tie things together. In the Birmingham Gazette, it says new turn in French Marie mystery. See, not a sensational title. They've just gone with something standard. The man sought was one seen in the company of Elsie McMahon. That's French Marie. They're using what they believed was her proper name, also known as French Marie, on the afternoon of the 16th of August, the day on which she was found strangled in a flat off Euston Road. He was described as having a North Country accent and is believed to be a native of Newcastle. Again, very simple, very similar to how we were with French Fifi. Sunday Pictorial, which, I'll be honest, have a tendency, they're very tabloidy. They make up a lot of bullshit. But even with this, they make a couple of mistakes, like making reference to her being Irish French, but they're being lazy by going, well, one of her surnames is McMahon. Potentially her father might have been Irish, so we'll say she's French-Irish. She's not. But when they describe the man who was seen as who we will later know is Norman Stephenson, they describe him as 5'3" to 4", sallow complexion, clean-shaven, mousy brown slick-back hair which was greased, slightly curly, North Country accent, and was employed as a kitchen hand. Not terrible. I mean, he doesn't have a hunchback, does he? He doesn't have teeth drooling with blood, which is what you'd expect from them. They've just gone for the basics. In fact, it's ironic. It's actually in the police report itself that the police report is slightly more sensational than I would have wanted to see, or what you'd see with the press. Like, even on page 1 of the police report, I can't remember who the officer is in charge of that one, but he describes French Marie as fat and ugly, which is absolutely abhorrent. And even with the description as well, whoever wrote the report wrote it as that Marie and Norman Stephenson were involved in a drunken orgy. It's not really a drunken orgy, is it? It's two people having a couple of beers then having sex. Not really a drunken orgy. But that's it throughout as well. They're constantly when they're really moving ahead and they really want all these murders to be connected. With French Marie, they do make some occasional references to the Soho Strangler, but it's really vague, and the other murders as well. So, Evening Standard, 17th of August, capital letters, unsolved murders. Certain facts in the case, particularly that the women may have met their death by strangulation, have induced Superintendent Yandel to instruct his assistants to re-examine the facts discovered in the 3 unsolved murders of the women in Soho. Nothing is yet to suggest that there is any connection between the 4 cases, and this line of inquiry is a routine one. Holy shit! factual accuracy. I mean, they've said it could be connected, nothing to suggest them yet. This is just a routine inquiry. Holy shit. That's absolutely, it's a miracle. Unfortunately, there are some other articles out there which do love to ramp it up, like the Sunday Sun. Headline in bold and capitals: Soho crimes recalled. The sinister significance of a crime in its resemblance to the others, which within the last 2 years have taken place in Soho, without the guilty being brought home to anyone. These were the cases of French Fifi, Marie Janet Cousins, they've got her name wrong, and Constance Hind, again wrong. Bold capitals: the riddle of Paulette. So that's fine, because one of her prostitute names was French Paulette. They state that the radio was turned on to drown out the call for help. It wasn't. It was just they had the music on. Various theories of the crime are being considered, but it is believed that the cause was a quarrel over money. See, not terrible. It's likely that was what happened. And I think that's pretty much it. As you can see, the kind of the way that they demonize the person is by putting. We as the reader put ourselves on a higher pedestal than them. We can look down on them, and because we're looking down on them, we can go, well, that's why they were murdered. You wouldn't get that if they were wealthy, would you? Or attractive, or of someone who we're meant to regard highly, because they're of a lower level, because they're foreign, because they're women. That makes it easier to demonize them, and therefore we can focus on the killer, and we can praise the killer for doing an amazing job, being skillful and intelligent and witty, and even as some people do, suggest that a serial killer is charming. If you enjoyed that, there's more to come. Your regular episodes of Murder Mile will return on Thursday the 27th of April, or a few days earlier via Patreon.